Hi, Judd.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. You?
I'm good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blog Hits TV. You are Judson Brewer. You may be familiar to our viewers because you've been with us before talking about your research on meditation and the brain, but now you have a new home. You were at Yale Medical School before, and now you are the Director of Research at the Mindfulness Center at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, which I think may be kind of the granddaddy of all mindfulness centers or something. It's been around a while, hasn't it?
It has. It's the oldest standing, kind of formed by John Kabat-Zinn back in the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
and really a foundation in the field.
Mm-hmm. That's good. And this is like your first day there or something, right? You just moved there.
I just moved in last week, yeah. So got a few things on the wall and been hanging out in my office for the first time today.
Okay. Well, last time we talked a little about your research, and then I wound up getting so enthralled in your own meditative experience that I wound up asking a lot of questions about that. Then I realized I should have asked you more questions about the brain science. So I'd like to visit some of that a little more extensively this time. Now, your finding had to do with this default mode network thing, right?
Yes.
And maybe, although we talked about that a little last time, you could kind of review for us what that is.
Sure. The default mode network is a series of brain regions that are connected. That's why it's called the network. And that network seems to be implicated in, one, self-referential processing, but it's named the default mode network because it happens. That's kind of what we default to when we're not doing anything specific. And so we tend to default to self-referential things, thinking about ourselves, worrying about what we're going to do next, regretting things we did in the past, things like that.
Okay. So it's largely about the self, and it is also largely about the future or the past, right?
Yes. And I guess it can include thinking about ourselves in the present, but it's one that involves like me doing something as compared to just stuff happening.
I see. You're okay. So you're actually thinking about what you're doing, or
Yeah, or almost
something immediately, or something.
right, almost like you can think of that little internal monitor, or the little guy in our head that's saying, "Oh, you just screwed up on that," or "I can't believe you did that," or "Oh, what's that guy going to think of me," or this or that.
Self-consciousness, among other things.
Yes.
So that would be me then. So what you found is that, and you're not alone. I think this is becoming a pretty well substantiated finding. I'm not sure, but that the default mode network gets quieter during meditation.
Yes.
In both adept meditators, which was the focus of your study that appeared in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, but also you found, I think, in novices, right? You can see a little of this going on, a little quieting of the default mode network.
Sometimes the novices certainly got that, and we saw this most with some of the real-time neurofeedback work that we were doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and this is true of more than one type of meditation, right? It's not just mindfulness meditation.
Yeah, we studied specifically 3 different types of meditation because we were interested in what was convergent between the 3. So a concentration, similar to a mantra type meditation where you focus on your breath. Loving kindness meditation, which is similar to prayer, where you're wishing beings well, and then just a choiceless awareness where there's an awareness, but there's no self in that awareness. So all three of them seem to deactivate one particular brain region of the default mode network called the posterior cingulate cortex.
And this makes sense just intuitively, right? I mean, to a meditator, because as you sink into meditation, the kind of stuff that your default mode network is generating seems to subside. The kinds of thoughts you would expect a default mode network to generate do seem to subside, right?
It depends on the type of concentration. So with samadhi or concentration, absolutely. You become one pointed on a certain object, whether it's a mantra or the breath or something else. And then, the awareness gets absorbed into that object. And so the self-referential thinking absolutely goes down. Mm-hmm. But with choiceless awareness, that's more of just allowing that narrative to come up and be. Mm-hmm. But I think the difference here is that you're not caught up in it. So, we think something, we say, oh, I can't believe I did that. And it's kind of like we mentally cringe and go, oh, I can't believe I did that. Well, that mental contraction could be what the posterior cingulate is doing. So our relationship to our thoughts may be how the posterior cingulate gets activated when we get caught up in those. And then when we're not caught up, when we're just allowing those thoughts to arise and pass away without getting caught up in that narrative, that may be where the posterior cingulate gets quiet.
Although I gather it's often the case that to get to choiceless awareness or any kind of mindfulness meditation for that matter, you often start with a concentration meditation to kind of calm your mind.
That is the standard practice, yes.
So kind of quieting the default mode network is almost the entry into almost any form of meditation.
It can be. I've seen people that, that's a standard thing. I've also seen people try other things as well.
Mm-hmm. So before we talk any more about that, can we back up and, there have been so many findings about the brain and meditation. Can we just review a few and, if nothing else, make sure that I'm right, that I have actually heard these terms in its connection with meditation. So there's been a lot of, well, we should say you've been doing brain scans, which is not the same as an EEG, and it picks up on different kinds of things, right? And one of the EEG findings has to do with, I think, gamma waves.
Well, I think the most commonly reported EEG findings are alpha changes, yeah. And some people report increases in alpha, and some people report decreases in alpha with meditation. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty consistent. The gamma is interesting because, one, it's often difficult to pick out an accurate gamma signal because it can be contaminated by muscle artifacts. So when you clench your jaw or you wrinkle your forehead, you can increase your gamma. But if you look at particular regions of the brain, so when people do intracranial recordings of EEG, they find that the posterior cingulate is part of the default mode network. The gamma actually correlates with volt signal, so with the fMRI signal. So when people are doing self-referential thinking, the gamma goes up, and when they're concentrated on a task, the gamma goes down. Mm-hmm. So if you look at specific brain regions as compared to overall, scalp electrode activity, gamma could play a role there, yes.
Okay. And what about alpha? I mean, it just these things sound almost hopelessly vague, but in other words, with the default mode network, I guess I would say that kind of just makes sense, right? Given that it is the mind wandering, and meditation involves doing less of that makes sense. But with the alpha and gamma wave stuff, it just seems to me like at this point it must be much more open to interpretation.
I think because it's measuring scalp electrical activity, if that's what you're looking at, it is much harder to figure out what's going on. I would say, people are starting, and we're even starting to explore this ourselves. People are starting to use what's called source estimation or source localization, where they can actually pick out brain regions and look at the electrical activity in those brain regions using EEG. Those methods over the next couple of years, I think, will help to figure out where there's a convergence with the fMRI and the EEG signals, as they're already doing with intracranial EEG signals. And that's where we'll be able to figure out how those signals line up with meditation.
Okay. Are there, do we know enough about brain regions to kind of suspect that certain things reported in meditation might involve certain, regions or networks or, functional areas like, so for example, let's, I guess I'm thinking of kind of specific Buddhist doctrines. So let's say something like, when people say they have there's a diminished, the sense of self kind of subsides in some sense. Okay. Now there's a number of ways people describe that. One way is to say that the kind of boundary between self and other things seems more porous or less firm. There's a kind of a flowing into the rest of reality or something. Is there any sense for what that might involve in the brain?
And I think there are a lot of different ways that people describe that. So flowing in, a dissolving of an artificial, conceptual boundary of self and other. I would hypothesize that, well, again, we are somewhat posterior cingulate centric. So, everything to me it relates back to that. But that may be one of the regions that is involved in this self-other duality thing. So if you think of getting caught up in experience, that could be the sense of self-other, where we're caught up in experience. Whereas when we're not caught up in experience, there's this wide open awareness, and there's a flow-like experience. And when we're wide open and just aware, there's no caught upness at all. There's there's nothing, no boundary to push against. There's no resistance. It's just awareness and things happening. So that may, and that's one thing that we're studying, is to see if the posterior cingulate actually tracks with that getting caught up in versus kind of really relaxing into just an awareness and watching things unfold.
Okay, when you say you're kind of PCC centric, you mean you have just made a habit of studying the posterior cingulate cortex yourself?
Yeah, it was right. It was the strongest finding that we had in our PNAS paper, and we've just done a replication study with twice the sample size. Very similar design, where we even included a different baseline condition to see if that was affecting the results. And again, the posterior cingulate came out in our whole brain analysis. It came out as the strongest candidate. So we're seeing consistent results with the posterior cingulate. And then added on top of that, when we start to line that up with subjective experience moment to moment to moment with the neurofeedback, that seems to also suggest that this getting caught up versus relaxing into awareness is manifest in the posterior cingulate. Now, that would mean that it's part of a whole network of brain regions, and it's just a sentinel or a proxy. But we've really only investigated that region when we've done most of these neurofeedback experiments.
But it's considered kind of a hub or one of the main nodes of the default mode network.
Yes, it is.
And what else do we know, if anything, from just studies in general about what kinds of things it's involved in, aside from things you've already alluded to?
It's involved in a host of things. So when you're anxious, your posterior cingulate gets active. Mm-hmm. When you crave cigarettes, your posterior cingulate gets active. When you worry about things, when you're future-oriented. Interestingly, there's this phenomenon called choice justification. When you have two objects and you rate them the same, and then suddenly you're told to pick one, and you pick this one, and suddenly you like this one a lot more. Mm-hmm. You justify your choice, and that involves activation of the posterior cingulate. So you could think of that as, in Buddhist terms, as getting attached to something in real time. When people are told to lie, their posterior cingulate gets activated. So there are a number of different tasks that can activate the posterior cingulate, and the one unifying piece there, at least one unifying piece that we could come up with, is all of those involve kind of getting caught up in experience or getting attached to something.
And a lot of them are kind of affective. I mean, you have a reaction, and in that regard, I mean, I'm kind of ask, is that part of what used to be called, and maybe is still called, the limbic system, the larger realm of emotional kind of processing? I mean, or at least what was thought to be that at one time, or affective kind of processing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think these midline structures are certainly involved in affective in processing. Some describe this as in the hot and cold processing systems, the midline structures are more affective or hot processing. So you impulsively do things, versus the more lateralized structures like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex are more cognitive. So if you think of, Mr. Spock's the epitome there. He wouldn't be using his midline Vulcan structures, but he would be using his more lateralized structures because he would be thinking logically, highly illogical, Captain. That's how he always talked.
Right.
For those Star Trek reference, for those of you that completely were lost by Mr. Spock.
It has been a while. On the other hand, there's been a new version of Star Trek roughly every 5 years, I guess, either in movies or TV.
That's true.
So when you said that the posterior cingulate cortex could be involved in this kind of diminished sense of the difference of the bounds between you and others, I mean, is it specifically associated with the actual self-conception? Like when we think about, if you close your eyes and think of your boundaries, or do you just mean that it tends to be involved in the self getting tangled up in stuff?
That's a great question. I don't have a good answer to that, but I guess I would follow that by asking a question. Well, how do you know the difference between those? Getting entangled and, having this self-other boundary. Mm-hmm. To me, they seem very similar.
I guess, although the getting tangled, wanting cigarettes or thinking of justifying a choice or something doesn't seem to be involving kind of envisioning your actual bounds, which is something you can do. You can close your eyes and think, these are my bounds. This is where I am. And it is set apart from the other stuff, right?
You can, but that seems like a very cognitive exercise as compared to, I think of the self as a very affective system.
Right. So, okay, what about another aspect of the not self experience, which is more interior? I mean, you can, on the one hand, think, well, the bounds between me and reality are actually porous, or between me and other people are porous. But you can also kind of look inward and decide, wait a second, I am not the CEO here. There is no CEO here. There's just stuff happening. Thoughts are bubbling up. Emotions flow by. This is a much more chaotic system than I had imagined. That's a common report too, which is almost the flip side of the not self experience in a way. I'll let you ponder that. You seem not to necessarily agree.
Well, how is it? So it seems similar to a not self. Is that what you're saying?
It is not. I didn't mean the opposite of not self. I meant it's the interior version of not self. I mean, we should say, for those who don't know, not self is a big Buddhist doctrine. The Buddha supposedly insisted that in some sense the self is an illusion. And I'm saying that kind of has two facets. One is to doubt the bounds between you and the rest of the world, and the other is to doubt the internal solidity of yourself, the extent to which it is a kind of hierarchy with you in charge, right?
Yes, and I would see those very much along the spectrum of the same thing.
Well, they are aspects of the same doctrine in a way, but experientially, don't they? Well, you're saying that even, and we should say, if anyone doesn't remember, you're also a very serious meditator yourself, I would say, certainly compared to me. You're saying that experientially, these two things tend to kind of happen at the same time, or?
They can. I mean, you can be watching phenomena arise in the body, and you can also be aware of phenomena outside of the body. And so, for example, feeling a sensation in the body can be experienced in awareness, in the field of awareness, no differently than hearing a sound, yet the sound isn't generated internally.
Right.
So in that sense, they're part of the same continuum. And awareness is aware of each of them. They're just through a different sense door.
So that would be choiceless awareness, one of the kinds of meditation you studied. Mm-hmm. And so that might tend to unite those two aspects, I guess, of that I distinguish between. Choiceless awareness would tend to both make your interior seem kind of diffuse and make it seem connected with the exterior.
Yeah.
And do we know anything about the what's going on in the brain that's more specific than the quieting of the default mode network, which, as we said, happens with other forms of meditation as well?
Is there anything more specific with choiceless awareness? Yeah, great question. I have no idea. It's really hard to really pinpoint this stuff. It takes a lot of subjects just to get commonalities and to really try to look at differences between different meditation techniques is proving quite a challenge.
Mm-hmm. I will bet. I mean, how do you break it down generally? I mean, you've got, and maybe we should say, define another term. I mean, as you said, concentration meditation is focusing on one thing, breath, mantra. It is known to sometimes bring serenity, even bliss. Mindfulness is more about actually paying attention to things within your realm of experience without the kind of attachment that is, without the self-involvement that is more natural.
Right. And when you get rid of the self-involvement, it's pretty blissful too.
Yeah, that can be nice. Yeah, that can be nice, I guess. I don't know. Yeah. Although sometimes challenging. So, for example, mindfulness might involve mindfulness of an unpleasant sensation. But the idea is that viewing it mindfully is at least less unpleasant than viewing it, than letting it do what it normally does, which is grab hold of you and direct your thought and behavior.
Absolutely. And Shinzen Jiang, I think, describes this nicely. He says that, it's suffering equals, resistance. Suffering is proportional to resistance. So the more you resist an experience, the more suffering you're going to have. And so you can, like you're saying, the more you get entangled, the more you resist, the more you worry about, the more you get caught up in pain or anything else, the more suffering there's going to be.
Yeah. He said an interesting thing. He was on, I talked to him on Blogging Heads, and he described the view you have of maybe of an unpleasant feeling when you're viewing it mindfully as poignant. And I just the other day, I think, kind of got a sense for what he means. I think he means, first of all, you're looking at it clearly. It's an acute view, but also it hasn't lost all of its affective. I mean, you're perceiving its affective quality in a certain sense, but it's almost more like you're watching it in a movie. When you see a poignant scene, when you see suffering in a movie, and you go kind of, oh, that's sad, but it's not like grabbing you. Does that make sense?
I think so, and I think another element there is when you truly, and not just cognitively, but when you truly experience things as as conditionally generated. So somebody is a product of their own conditioning. And so if somebody comes out and lashes out at you or yells at you, that can actually be seen as two ways. One is you get defensive, you resist, you push back, you yell back, whatever, lots of suffering, plenty of suffering. We all know that. Yeah. But when you just see in that moment that, of course, this person had to have yelled at me. This is a product of endless conditioning. There's this poignant quality to it where you just can't help but love them because there's no, of course, they could not do anything else. This is who they are.
You're on a much higher spiritual plane than I am on, Judd, I gotta say. I'm not there yet. I'm not loving the people screaming at me yet. I'll send you an email when I get there, okay?
Should we practice? You want me to yell at you?
Scream at me and let me see how it works. Go ahead. Come on, bring it on. George Bush said, bring it on. Yeah, well, that's impressive, though, if you can do that on a day-to-day basis. You might as well. There's no other reaction that's productive.
Well, it's not even, I don't think it's something we can consciously do. It's when you tap into the universe, it happens. And, for some people tap in more than others. And my sense is that's what we're all training toward, is to see this because that's an ongoing experience. Everybody's part of this unfolding, and it's poignant. It's beautiful.
It is a true fact that presumably, to look at another way, if I had been born in someone else's shoes, that is to say, with their genes, had exactly their series of environmental experiences, I would be doing just what they're doing. That follows from the standard behavioral science model, which is that there's only two things: there's genes and environment, according to the standard behavioral science model. We don't know for sure, but it's kind of commonsensically makes sense, and it follows that because our standard way of deciding whether someone else is to blame is to say, well, would I have done that? And if you say, well, yeah, I would have done it, then they're not to blame. Then they did something wrong. Whereas if I would have done it, or if I wouldn't have done it, then you can blame them. And yet it follows from the basic model of science that we would have actually done everything that everyone is doing.
Yeah. And then we can move beyond blame and to, okay, what can we learn from this so that it doesn't happen again? It's not to say that anger is useful or helpful, but it's to say, of course, this is the conditioning, and can we bring awareness to this moment so we, and maybe even they, can learn from this so that that anger, the conditioning changes for the next time. So we can affect, the karmic, they say that you've got past karma, which creates the conditions for this moment, and your present karma affects what you're going to do with this moment. So if somebody yells at you, you have the opportunity right there to love it or resist. And if you love it, then you're less likely to be reactive the next time somebody yells at you. And that's your conditioning that moves in a positive way.
Oh, so that's a kind of a scientific version of karma almost, in the sense that, you're saying if you manage to be less reactive to the person, you will in the future do less stuff to other people that generates negative reactions.
Right, because I would argue that karma is it's an explanation of conditioning, which is, according to the teachings, the Buddha was contemplating dependent origination on the night of his enlightenment, and that led to his conception of karma. And what's karma? Cause and effect. Cause and effect is conditioning. And conditioning is genetic and environmental, and it's learning. We learn, by association. We learn, that's our most basic form of learning. And so all of that fits beautifully. You can, karma sounds much less voodoo that way and much more common sense and scientific.
But of course, there are parts of the teaching that are less easy to reconcile with science. For example, karma was supposed to transcend the bounds between two lifetimes of a reincarnated being, right? So,
well, that was a later teaching, though. I don't think that you could actually trace that back to the original teachings. And I'm not a scholar, so you have to ask the scholars about this. But from what I understand, you can those frameworks were used in the day. So the Buddha used those frameworks to teach because people could understand them. Mm-hmm. But you can think of one moment to the next moment as one lifetime to the next lifetime. And in that sense, it's very practical and very useful. This lifetime to the next, we can't measure that. So why is it even useful to think about or talk about? I think about how can I decrease suffering now, as compared to, well, maybe I'll build up my karmic storehouse for my next life. That's less interesting.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This leads to a question you must get asked this occasionally. You're obviously into meditative practice and Buddhist practice, as many researchers in this area are. I assume people sometimes say, wait a second, you're too invested in this to do research on it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. We've got data. Yeah. That's why you design, randomized controlled trials. Right. That's why you design well-controlled, basic science studies. I think Richard Feynman said, what is it? Something about you must not fool yourself. And in science, the easiest person to fool is yourself. Right. And so we have to be really careful about fooling ourselves. Right. And that's why we have to design good experiments, especially ones where we're interested in whether the answer is yes or no, so that we're less likely to be biased. But absolutely, I'm biased by my own experience. Yeah. But that's why, I do blinded studies.
Well, the truth is, all scientists have to struggle with this, and lately there's been a wave of discussion of this. In psychology broadly, scientists have a stake in becoming famous. Leave aside, whether what they're studying has some connection to their lives. There's always an incentive to generate spectacular results, and that's turning out to be kind of a problem.
Right. Well, if you look at academia, you don't get paid a lot, and you work a ton, and so really, there's a lot of what do you do it for? Well, some people do it for their ego, and so that carrot, maybe it's not the money carrot, it's not the easy, work half a day carrot. It's the I want to get famous carrot.
Mm-hmm. Did you see this piece in the New York Times Magazine about it's kind of the downside of your default mode network getting quiet, you might say.
Which piece are you talking about?
It was recent. It was like, I think, the last week. And what were so there were a couple of findings.
Is this about creativity?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the one finding was the higher adults scored on measurement of mindfulness, the worse they performed on tests of implicit learning, whatever that is.
Yeah. So I actually, and I'll send you a link to a Huffington Post blog I just wrote in rebuttal to this because it was an interesting article.
Uh-huh.
So there are two pieces there. One is that study from Georgetown, I believe, about implicit learning hasn't been published yet, so I haven't been able to read it myself to see what they're talking about. From the New York Times article, it sounds like they're using some type of self-reported measure of mindfulness. Now, these self-reported measures of mindfulness tend to measure the absence of mind wandering, which I would argue does not equal the presence of mindfulness. So the other study that they talked about, which has been published for several years and has gotten some good publicity from Jonathan Schooler's group, talks about creativity. And they gave people an easy task and a hard task and measured creativity. And they found that when people did an easy task, their minds wandered more and they were more creative. Mm-hmm. But if you look at their study, and again, this would be a fun discussion to have with them. If you look at their study, they gave the easy task, and it's hard to see if they actually controlled for just the effortless versus the effortful quality of the task and whether that correlated. So if you really have to concentrate on something really hard, if you use all of your brain's CPU, use 100% of that thing to do a task, it doesn't have any room to go and think about a creative problem or to solve something because it's completely used up. Whereas if you do an easy task, your brain can wander because that's what our default mode is. Mm-hmm. And you can also be creative. But if you look at a couple of things, one is the amount of time that we actually mind wander is about 50% of life. If you believe the study that Killingsworth did and reported a couple of years ago in Science. So you could be sitting around not thinking of anything in particular, and you could have an insight, and there's a 50% chance that your mind will have wandered at that moment. So there's a 50% chance that this would happen and this would happen, but it could be true, and unrelated. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm much more creative when things are effortless for me. And so I would argue that it would be worth looking to see if it's the quality of effort that was put into it. Mm-hmm. And that also fits with the study the data that we've seen where experienced meditators, when they're really decreasing their posterior cingulate activity, they're talking about completely effortless awareness. It is effortless. And that's really what strong mindfulness is. It's completely effortless. How much effort does it take for you to hear the sound of my voice?
Not much.
Yeah, that's really good awareness.
I'm proud of myself then.
Keep it up. Good job.
It was nothing, really. It was nothing. So, and another question is related to this. My reaction to that study is that, a study that says some good things come from mind wandering wouldn't surprise me if that's true. In my case, there's no danger of my mind wandering being cut to zero. And so a question is, I'm lucky if I sit down and meditate and keep it under control for that period. But a question is, somebody like you who meditates more intensively and has done so for longer, is it the case that you would say that throughout the day, your default mode network, your mind wandering is kind of lower than it would be if you had never started the practice in a significant way? You do in the aggregate a whole lot less mind wandering than you otherwise would.
I would say there's probably less mind wandering, and I would also say more striking to me is the amount that I get caught up in stuff. So when I get reactive, I see that much more quickly, and then it just happens to let go because it's too painful to hold on. Mm-hmm. And so I would say there's less mind wandering. I can certainly be more focused. But the quality of my experience is vastly different. It really feels much less effortful, mm-hmm. like a big weight lifted.
Okay. Well, I know you've got to go before long. I have one more question about something my daughter said, which I thought was an interesting thing to say. Both my daughters have been on a couple of meditation retreats, and we were talking about mindfulness and about how observing an emotion, a feeling, can kind of keep you from getting caught up in it. So if you think about this person you dislike, you have that feeling of dislike, you focus on the feeling, and as a result, you wind up not getting caught up in, plotting your revenge fantasy or listing this long list of grievances against them. And she said, well, yeah, but, in a way, what's happening there is you're just getting distracted. I mean, I think this was in response to saying, this is different from just trying to distract yourself from it. This is like, in a certain sense, confronting it. But she said, actually, I think it is a form of distraction. You're by focusing on the feeling, you're not, maybe you could focus on anything, but you're getting distracted from the thoughts that the feeling normally induces by continuing to dwell on the feeling, if that makes any sense.
It does. And I think I agree. You can certainly distract yourself by focusing on a feeling. Mm-hmm. Insight meditation is called insight meditation, not distraction meditation, because you get insights about experience. And so it's about, you don't pay attention just to pay attention. You pay attention to see the results of your actions. This goes back to the conditioning we were talking about earlier. So when you can pay attention closely enough, I use this analogy of a burning coal. If you're holding onto a burning coal and you're not paying attention, you're going to burn yourself. But if suddenly you pay attention, you drop the coal just naturally because it's painful. And if you see how painful it is to get caught up in emotions, mm-hmm. you just naturally stop doing it. It's not about distracting yourself. It's just about seeing, this is too painful.
Right. But in that sense, I think you could say that even if that starts out as a form of distraction, to just look at the thought, it's a form of distraction that in a way gets positive reinforcement, right? Because you don't do the thing that winds up causing you the suffering. I mean, I guess what I'm suggesting is maybe there is some of that in what we call mindfulness. Developing the habit of just looking at the feeling and not getting caught up in it could involve positive reinforcement for distraction, in a sense.
Right. And in Majjhima Nikaya 20, I think the Buddha described 5 different things to do when you can't be mindful, when you can't really, disengage. And one of those things is distraction. So he described it as skillful means, more so than continuing to perpetuate unskillful behavior.
But he had to find distraction in the sense of thinking about something totally different, thinking about roses or something, presumably.
Well, he typically the distraction, you would replace unskillful with skillful. So you would replace your unskillful behavior with something like loving kindness or compassion so that you can actually, that's the best substitution strategy to use is replace with loving kindness.
But in any event, I gather you would say that part of mindfulness is developing the habit of looking at the feeling rather than letting it carry, and that becomes a way of not letting it carry you away.
Right. And there are 2 pieces there. One is you don't get caught up in the thought proliferation, but the other piece is when you pay attention to the feeling, you see how painful it is. And that to me is the most helpful part. You see how painful it is. And then you start to say, "Oh, I don't want to do that again." Mm-hmm. You become disenchanted. He described disenchantment. Mm-hmm.
Although you don't run away from the feeling at the time.
Absolutely you don't. You just become disenchanted with doing it again. Mm-hmm. Again, you're less likely to be reactive in the future because you see how not helpful it was right now.
And how far would you say we are from taking a dynamic like that? The moment you see the feeling and seeing what's going on in the brain at that moment. Do you think we're 2 years away, 10 years away?
Oh, within 2 years, I think. The real-time fMRI has a few second delay, but that seems to work pretty well already. When we can get real-time EEG neurofeedback working, where we can look at source-estimated brain regional, localized brain regions, then we can start to correlate that subjective experience in very high temporal resolution, like milliseconds.
Okay. Well, good. Then I look forward to figuring all this out with your help. Thanks for taking the time on, just so soon after your move to UMass. So you're right there in the Amherst area, I guess, huh?
Actually, the medical school is in Worcester.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, so that's not that far from. I mean, you can drive to IMS for a weekend retreat, right?
It is fewer than 30 miles away.
Yeah. So there you go.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, and
sure. Thank you.
Good luck at your new perch.
Thank you. Take care.